Is there life beyond Earth? That wasn't one of the options. I like that option, but it wasn't one of the options. Now, everybody's got to vote. You either say, yes, there is. No, there isn't. And actually, I lied. I don't know is one of the options. The third option is, yes, there is. No, there isn't. Or, I don't know. Will you please tell me? Now, everybody's got to vote. Who many thinks, yes, there is? All right, got some people out there. We got some here. All right. You got anybody else here? So you guys are all no, there's not? Okay, how many say no, there's not? Y'all didn't vote over there. Not everybody over there voted. All right, okay, good. All right, now, so we got kind of, I'm going to do this with just the youth here. The parents out there can think too, but so you guys say, yes, there is life out there. I would like you to give me your top 2 or 3 reasons why you think there's life out there. You guys collaborate there for a second. And you guys were mostly no, there's not out there, right? So you guys got to get together and give me your top 2 or 3 reasons why you think there's not life out there. So you got about 20, 30 seconds to collaborate and figure out what that is. And for those of you out there thinking, great, throw it back on the ground for you. So I want you to be thinking of that too. Why do you think there is or isn't life out there? Because as I was looking into this, what I recognize is people have been talking about this for centuries, if not millennia. In fact, it would not surprise me if we were to go back to the Garden of Eden to find that Adam and Eve were arguing about this. Because it's such a fascinating question. So, all right, we're going to call upon, who's the bold spokesperson here? It's got to be somebody under 25. Okay, so what? Give me your top 2, 3 reasons if you want.
Okay, well, there's people that went out on the space station, and if we can go out there, then there's life.
Okay. So the fact that we were able to go out there means life can be out there. Okay, that's one reason.
And I feel like there could be life, as in like bacteria or like plants, or even Mandy said animals, but we don't think it's intelligent life because we're the only ones made in God's image and with free will. Okay, so you got, we can go out there, there may be other animals, but there's nothing sentient like us out there. Yes.
All right, so you think there might be life, but nothing like us. You have something you want to add to that? Go ahead.
In my opinion, why would a creator stop creating?
So there's just lots of space out there. God might have done it.
Yeah.
All right, that's a good answer. I'm going to take the mic over here because I would now like your reasons. Who's the bold spokesperson? All right, you pointed last. Go ahead, you can hold it.
Okay.
Give me your top 2 or 3 reasons why you think there's no life out there.
Well, we said that if there were life out there, then we think that it would have been included in the creation narrative in Genesis.
Okay.
And then also we thought that. What was it you said, Joel?
I didn't say anything.
What did Joel say?
So you think there is life out there? You're just at the wrong table, man. Okay, that's all right. So we help him out. What was the other reasons?
Joel, speak up. You did say something. You did.
Okay, so you think largely if it happened, God would have told us something about it here, and the fact that we haven't means that it probably didn't happen.
Yeah.
All right, very good. So I have, go ahead and turn that off so I don't get feedback. For those of you who think there's life out there, I've got a special message just for you. If you didn't think there was life out there, or if you don't know, just kind of do something else for a minute here, but those of you who thought there was life out there, I think there's good reason to think there might be life out there. Now, for those of you who didn't think there was life out there, I got a special message for you. If you thought there was life out there or don't know, this is not for you. I think there's good reason to think we may be the only life in the universe.
You already know, man.
Okay. I think, what in the world's he talking about? Well, as I've been thinking about this is one of those questions as a Christian and as a scientist. I thought, what happens if we discover life out there? What do I do with that? And so I have spent a number of years thinking about why might there be life out there, why there might not be life out there, and what would I do as a Christian if I found that. And so we're just going to kind of go through those questions tonight. Why life might exist out there. Now, I know I'm not sure where you are in your scientific studies, but if you're talking about life, what are the elements that are incredibly important to life? Who can give me one of them? Yeah.
Like food, water, health source.
So I'm going even more fundamental to that, like periodic table type elements? Yes.
The ability to seek to sustain itself.
Okay, but even more fundamental to that. I'm talking just elements on the periodic table. Carbon, yes. What else? Oxygen, yes, that's going to be important. What else? Hydrogen, yes. What else? Nitrogen, yes. There's actually two more if you remember them. Phosphorus and sulfur, yes. So let's go. We've got this interesting thing we can do as scientists. We can go out and say, how much of these things are there in the universe? And unfortunately, this is kind of a hard to see slide, but this is all the elements on the periodic table sorted by abundance over there. And if you'll notice, that's actually a logarithmic scale. So if you go from, well, no, it's not that one. If you go from 1 up there to 100, so this element right there, you go up to that one's 100 times more abundant. But if you look up there, you got hydrogen, and you got helium. That's not really useful for life, but it's really important that it forms. And then lo and behold, you got carbon, and then not oxygen, and nitrogen's right in there. Sulfur's a good second. Phosphorus ends up, or phosphorus ends up down there. But what you notice is that when the universe first formed, the only elements that were in it were hydrogen and helium. Little bit of lithium, that is correct. That is correct. But all of these other elements are formed inside stars. As the stars burn, they make these heavier elements, and then they blow them out into space. At least some of those stars do. And what's fascinating is you would expect hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, those would be the most abundant elements you would expect because they're the lightest ones. Turns out our universe makes carbon and oxygen as coupled with hydrogen and helium. Those are the 4 most abundant elements in the universe. Now, for some reason, our universe is set up to make the elements that life requires. Well, if you're going to have life out there, you need not just the elements, you need a place where all this can happen. And over the last, we're in 2022, first planet was discovered in 1992, so over the last 30 years, we've been able to build instruments to find planets around other stars. And if you go to 1992, you got the first planets formed or discovered there, and then you notice that as the years go on, we find more and more planets. So we build more and more sensitive instruments, and we find more and more planets. Now, I stopped in 2015 just because that was kind of when we quit launching dedicated instruments to find stuff, but we've actually found thousands of planets around stars other than the sun. And the more we are sensitive to it, the more planets we find. And what's interesting is that as you look at the kinds of planets, if you go look at the masses, this is masses in terms of Jupiter, so Jupiter would be way down here at 1. But you'll notice, again, there's this logarithmic scale, which means that's 10 times more than that. You'll notice that as the mass gets smaller, the number of planets gets larger and larger, kind of like earthquakes. There's a couple of big ones and a whole lot of small ones. Well, we can take that data and do some calculations and say, how many different kinds of planets are there just in the Milky Way? How many Earth-sized planets would you expect just in the Milky Way galaxy? Somebody give me a number. 30. Is that your real number or just because it's a cool number? You just guessed. All right, I like that. Well, we know that larger planets are easier to detect. Their abundance increases as the mass decreases. And as we do that calculation, in the Milky Way galaxy alone, there are 400 billion planets Earth or larger. That's a few more than 30. So not only does our universe make the elements that life requires in great abundance, but it also makes planets in great abundance. And when we put all that together, we say, okay, we got the most abundant substances in the universe form the building blocks of life, huge numbers of planets in the universe. We've recognized that there's nothing special about the physical location where we are, and generally the way the universe behaves is the same as what it is here. It's reasonable to conclude that there might be other life out in the universe. So that's why life might exist in the universe. Let's go over to the other side of the equation. Why life might not exist in the universe. Well, when we look at life, when we look at planets forming, when we look at places, what we see is that this planet and the life on this planet has the hallmarks of design in it. One of the ways that shows up is when we look at the intricacies of the cell. This is a fellow named Francis Crick. Anybody heard of DNA? What's the unique property of DNA? How is DNA organized? It's organized in 2 strands, and it goes around in a helix, right? Well, this was one of the co-discoverers of the double helixed nature of DNA, and he and Watson were awarded a Nobel Prize for that. Fairly prominent skeptic says that Christianity is not correct, but he makes this statement. Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Now that's kind of an interesting statement. Why would he have to say that they have to keep in mind that it's not designed? Well, the reason why you have to do that, or why he would make that statement, is that when you look at DNA, life, various things, it looks like it's designed. Here's a few examples of where we see that design. So we have a genetic code. There are 4 letters to the genetic code. There's U, C, A, and G. And if I were a biochemist, I would know what those meant better. But there are the 4 letters, and the DNA is made up of these letters in repetitions. And there are certain combinations of these letters that when they form, or that when they're in the DNA in a certain way, they produce an amino acid. Now, there are 20 amino acids that are the building blocks of life. Now, but if you say, okay, there's 3 letters, and each of them could be 4, so you got 4 times 4, which is times 4, which is 64. Very good, yes. So if you got 64 possibilities, but only 20 amino acids, you'll notice that, like, let's go over here to leucine. Let's go over here to leucine. You notice that CUU, CUC, CUA, CUG all produce leucine. What that means is that you can have a mutation in that 3rd spot, and the genetic code will still produce leucine. And you notice that there are a number of them like that. What that does is that it means that DNA is designed in a way such that when errors are introduced, it still does what it's supposed to do. How many of you like computer programming? I love computer programming. How many times does your program quit working because you mistyped a letter? Every time it does it. The genetic code, you can mistype letters and it still works. It is amazing. In fact, scientists can study and say, how well does the genetic code minimize errors? And you'll notice that I've got this nice little thing over here. Here's what the genetic code is that is the backbone of all life. And it's sitting here on this normal distribution. So they can study and say, what are the ways it would normally look, or what are the usual or expected error minimization capacities of the genetic code? And you'll see that we're way out there on the end. Now, to give you a sample of what that means, I'm going to just talk about IQ. You know, whether IQ is a good measure of intelligence, that's not my point here. We know that as your IQ gets higher and higher, that is more and more rare. And so if you go with 100, that's right there in the middle of it. There's as many above as many below. If you go up to 130, that's what you're thinking. These are the bright people that you know, tend to have IQs around 130. Go up to 150, that's Mensa, that's genius level IQs. If you go up to 170, that's kind of like Albert Einstein type people. Notice, this is not a discussion on intelligence, but notice how far outside of the normal distribution the genetic code is in its capacity to minimize errors. It is literally 1 in a million. And not only that, it's actually it's not just 1 in a million in this local area. When you look at all the different ways it could be, it's one of, if not the best way to organize a code to minimize errors that might arise in the way life works. These are the sorts of things Francis Crick was noticing when he said we have to keep in mind that what we see was not designed but rather evolved. Another place where we see evidence of design. This is a simulation of what our solar system looked like early in its history. And just to give you a little bit of scale here, so we're going to go over here onto the right. There's the sun there, and this is just Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus. And then this big clump of junk out there. Now, somebody had the planet order here earlier. Who was it that had that? What was the planet order? Start with Jupiter. Going out. Jupiter, what's the next planet? So as you go from the sun out, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. I got you, I understand. Sorry, that was a bad question to ask. Notice that I said here, this is orbits. You got the star, and then you got Jupiter and Saturn and Neptune and Uranus. Notice that in the early part of the solar system, the orbits are compressed, and there's this big cloud of dust and debris out there. But early in the history of our solar system, the large planets migrated in and migrated out, and that stirred up the solar system, and you end up with this is the current configuration over here. Now you've got Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. So Neptune and Uranus switch places, the orbits got bigger, and all of that dust and debris got kicked out. It's 1,000 times less abundant. Now, why is that important? There is let's see, which way? I think that way's east. If you go east over to Albuquerque and head south a little bit, there is a crater called, is it that way? I know, the door's right over there. Okay. Anyway, okay, so we'll take your word. That's east. If you go east out to Albuquerque, there's this crater that's a mile wide, 700 feet deep, caused by an asteroid impact that was a few meters in diameter. Happens about every 50,000 years. If you go south down to the Yucatan Peninsula, I like this. You'll find that there is a much larger crater that was caused by an object that was a few miles in diameter that hit about 65, 67 million years ago, caused the dinosaurs to go extinct and about 90% of the rest of the life on Earth. Now, why is that important here? Notice that I said these things decrease, or the number of that junk decreased by about a factor of 1,000. Instead of meteor crater happening every 50,000 years, if this event had not happened, that would happen every 5,000 years. The asteroid that hit and destroyed the dinosaurs, instead of happening every 50 million years, would happen every 5 million years. No, sorry, that's not right. Instead of 50 million years, divide by 1,000, 50,000 years. Now that's the time scale that humanity's been on the Earth. So we see early in the history of the solar system, had this event not happened, the Earth would have been pummeled by very large objects that would have just destroyed life. Again, we see evidence of design. When we look even closer, we look at our moon. Our moon, we think, oh yeah, every planet has a moon. Well, it's true that lots of planets have moons, but our moon is the largest moon in the solar system compared to the planet that it orbits. Jupiter has larger moons, but Jupiter's huge. That's the question, how do you get something like that? Well, to get something like that, you have to have a Mars-sized object hit the Earth early in its history with just the right angle, just the right location, just the right speed to form a moon like this. The Earth's moon is very instrumental in terms of keeping the rotation axis stable so that it doesn't just flip around, which would be very bad for life. It's the dominant cause of all the tides, which keeps nutrients recycled on our planet. Our moon has a number of important roles it plays in keeping Earth habitable. And it's this very unique, rare collision that's actually what produced it. When we look out and say, what are the other planets? If we're looking out at these planets that we found beyond our solar system, we say, well, they're close enough to their stars, these would be habitable. Well, both Venus and Mars would be in that habitable range if we were looking around another star. But we can actually go to these planets and say, what do they look like? Venus is a very inhospitable place. Venus, the surface of Venus is about 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough that if you have a piece of paper, it would just spontaneously burst into flames, except it wouldn't because there's no oxygen there, because all the oxygen and water has escaped off into space. And so even though Venus is very similar to Earth in terms of size and would be habitable, we see that there's this whole sequence of events that keeps Venus from being habitable. And flip it around, go look at Mars. Mars is kind of cool. Do you know where the largest volcano in the solar system is? You'll never guess. It's on Mars. It's not one of those three. There's another one somewhere on there. Those are 2, 3, and 4. Because Mars has no tectonic activity. So where it gets volcanoes, these volcanoes just grow massive over time. Kind of cool thing here. This little thing there is something kind of like the Grand Canyon, except it would stretch all the way across the continental United States. But what you see is that there's no atmosphere, cold temperature, massive volcanoes on Mars. In fact, if you go to Mars, say, I'd like to breathe, you're going to have some problems because go up to the top of Mount Everest, humans just start dying because there's not enough oxygen up there. The atmosphere on Mars is 50 times less dense than what's at the top of Mount Everest. So again, we look at these planets and we say, yeah, that's in the range where we would say it's habitable, except we can look in detail and find out that, lo and behold, it is not very habitable. In fact, there's lots of things that have to happen on Earth to maintain its habitability over the last 4.5 billion years, where the sun's gotten brighter and asteroids have come in and hit and the planets have moved around and life has changed and the atmosphere has changed and the composition of the planet has changed so that there's land on it, and instead of just being an ocean that had a whole bunch of iron in it, all of these changes could have easily caused Earth to be uninhabitable, but all of these changes happened in this very integrated fashion. It's kind of like a symphony where all the instruments are playing together, because in spite of all of these changes, the average global temperature on Earth has not changed more than about 10 degrees Celsius over that entire history. And so we see that Earth looks like it's designed. In fact, one of the last things I'll mention about this is that we have found water. I mean, you look at Earth, it's just covered in water, right? I mean, you take a picture of Earth and it's covered in water. And then you ask the question, well, can we find water anywhere else? Turns out that we go out onto Mars. NASA built these cool probes that they were designed to work for 30 days, launched them, put them on Mars. They drove around for about 10 years. But they ran into this feature, or at least one of them, where they had 6 wheels, and one of the front wheels got jammed up and it wouldn't work anymore. So NASA, being the creative folks that they are, turned it around, drove it around backwards, just kind of dragged the wheel along. And as they dragged the wheel along, they unmarsed this white stuff. Can't unearth it. Wrong planet. They on Mars this white stuff. Now, anybody know what that white stuff is? No, it's silica. 90+% pure silica. Do you know how you get 90+% pure silica? You have a large body of water fed by silica that's dissolved, and as it gets there, it settles out, and you get silica deposits like this. So Mars was covered in water at one point in time, but all that water has disappeared. Lest you think I'm just making this up, we have another lander that we put on there. It's the Phoenix lander. And if you look here, they got these Martian Day 20, Martian Day 24. If you kind of look down in here, there are these nice 3 little rocks down in there that you come over here and look, and those rocks are not there. And the reason why is because those are not rocks, those are ice cubes. And after being unmarsed, they disappeared after about 4 days. And so we see that even though Earth is covered in water and it's still got this abundant water cycle, Mars started covered in water and all of its water disappeared. And in fact, we know the same is true. Venus started with an abundance of water and all of its water disappeared as well. So again, we see evidence of design. So why life might not exist anywhere in the universe is that the life looks designed and Earth looks designed, and if they look designed, maybe they are designed, and that they're only here because of intentional work of a creator. So, now let's get to the really question. Can we find it? Can we find it? Can we find it? Well, I love this quote by Stephen Vogt, who's an astrophysicist at the University of Santa Cruz. Said, personally, given the ubiquity and propensity of life to flourish wherever it can, I would say, my own personal feeling, is that the chances of life on this planet are 100%. Have almost no doubt about it. This was kind of your premise, correct? Where the conditions for life, we're going to get life, right? Of course, yeah. I mean, that's not an unreasonable claim to make. So we are now out looking for habitable planets. And this is, again, a little bit of an old slide, but basically the tenor of it is correct, is that you look and there's these currently potentially habitable planets. And if you'll notice, there are some that look like there's a bunch of rock and stuff on them, some covered in clouds. You got this cool little one down there, Kepler 186f, just comparison. You got Earth and Mars and Jupiter and Neptune over there. And if you go look a little more closely, on this website down in Arecibo where they're looking for stuff like this. You've got Earth on the right, Kepler 186f. You can see to scale, they're about the same size. I mean, you've got continents, you've got water and clouds there right below that. Notice we're going to flip it around just to not be confused there. Kepler 186 orbits a star that is much smaller, and so it's a very red star. And so there's this picture right below, and it's like, I mean, you've got clouds, you've got a sunset, you've got islands in there, water on there. How could there not be life on this planet? Now look closely. Do you notice these 3 little islands on Earth just happen to show up? This picture is meant to show what Earth would look like if it orbited that planet. But if you're not careful, you get the impression that Kepler 186f looks like this. And the reality of it is we have no idea whether there's any water on Kepler 186f. We don't know what's in its atmosphere. We don't know whether there's continents. We don't know whether there's any mountains because we have not the technology to detect it yet, and we won't probably for 20, 30 years. So it's a cool planet that we can say might be habitable, but the reason why I bring this up is to not get suckered in by cool images without understanding what the images are. Now, how we find planets, which is kind of cool. I mean, anybody in here know what a lightning bug is? You ever caught a lightning bug? Anybody? Okay. So you got these little things, they light up. They've got a rear end that lights up. That's just too cool for words. They're not very bright, though. You know what those big spotlights that say, hey, come shop at my store? The big beams that shine up into the sky. You know what I'm talking about? take that firefly, the lightning bug, put it on the rim of that spotlight, and say, find the light of the lightning bug in the midst of that huge beam of spotlight. That's the challenge of finding planets around other stars. Now, we've found a bunch of cool ways to do this. One of these ways is where we take and we look at a star, and if it's lined up properly, the planet will cut across the face of it, and it will dim the light from the star. And by finding this dimming of the light right here, we can tell what kind of planet it is. And this has, the kind of planets you can get down to a few Earth masses. It's got to be lined up, got to have really stable stars. You can get size of the planet, mass of the planet, orbit of the planet. If you're really, really lucky, you might get a little bit of information about the temperature in the atmosphere. But in general, all you get is size, mass, and orbit. Well, we've looked in our solar system. We found planets that are similar in size to the Earth, have similar orbits, but we know they're not habitable. So where we are in terms of finding habitable planets right now is kind of equivalent to, say, I'm gonna run a bunch of people, put a light a mile away. I'm going to have a bunch of people walk in front of the light, and from their shadows, pick me out an NBA basketball team. You just don't have the information you need. That's the challenge we have finding habitable planets. So it's a great, huge scientific advances. I don't want to minimize the scientific advance we've had. We just need to recognize that the capacity we have to find planets that might be habitable is really far away from actually answering the questions of whether the life actually exists on that planet. And so it's going to be a long time. So this is a diagram that shows most of the planets that we found. And you see there that you got the mass of the planet in terms of the mass of the Earth. So the Earth would be right in there. You got the period, so how many days it takes to go around. And you see there's Earth's right out about in there somewhere. And so if you look at all that and we say, all right, that's a lot of planets. If we now put our solar system on there, you see that most of our solar system is out of the range that we can actually detect. And so we're making huge strides, but the ability to actually find stuff like our solar system, we don't have that technology yet. So can we find it? Not for the next couple of decades, which is a bummer. But let me ask a different question. So we need to be aware, interesting question of whether there's life out there. We're not going to find it for quite a while, but what happens if we do? This is the question that bugged me as a Christian, thinking, all right, I've got all these arguments of why Earth or life on Earth might be unique. And all of that's going to go out the window if we find life somewhere else and something. All right, what do I do with that? Well, one of the things that I've found is that Christians have thought about this question for centuries. It's not like scientists have come along and said, hey, we can start finding planets, and these planets might have life, and the Christians are going, oh, we've never thought about that. We got to figure out what to do. Christians have been thinking about this for centuries, if not millennia. Does anybody know who Galileo Galilei is? What's Galileo Galilei famous for? Building telescopes, yes. He was a very prominent astronomer, very devout Christian, who as he was looking at the heavens and studying scriptures, he came to the conclusion, much like you guys did, that if God had created life, he would have told us about it, and he hasn't, so there's no life out in the universe, only here on Earth. Anybody know who Johannes Kepler is? Yes? No? Maybe. So he is I talked about that transit technique, the telescope it's called the Kepler telescope, named after Johannes Kepler. He was a very prominent astronomer who was able to map out orbits of stuff in our solar system, figure out lots of things. He was also a very devout, prominent Christian and a contemporary of Galileo. And he looked out and said, you know what? God's created all these bodies out here. He put life on all of them out there as well. So you've got Christians at the heart of when we started being able to measure the heavens, disagreeing about whether God created life somewhere else or not. There's nothing new about this discussion as far as Christians go. In fact, you could trace the discussion far further back than that, and Christians have said, you know what, we've thought about this. This fits in well. There's nothing about finding life that would be disruptive to believing Christianity. Because if you think about it, what is the central message of Christianity? Let's start at the beginning. Who's the central being in Christianity? God. What did God do? He created. What did he create? Everything. Okay, so now we shift from in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth to, and the earth was formless and void, darkness was on the surface of the deep, spirit was hovering over the surface of the waters. God does all this stuff to transform life from this hostile, uninhabitable, dark, water-covered world into a planet teeming with life, introduces humanity, and what's the first thing? Well, not the first thing. What's one of the prominent first things listed that humanity decided to do? He said, God, sorry, we're not going to listen to you. We're going to do it our way. All right. Did that surprise God in any sense or any fashion? No, because thousands of years later, God sent Jesus Christ to die on the cross to pay for our sins, to atone for our rebellion against God. So now let's ask the question, if we find life out there, and I'm going to go one further than you guys, not just maybe bacteria, I'm going to say, let's actually find sentient life out there. Is that a problem? Well, God's still the creator, correct? Did God still create or make earth and fashion it and form it to be a place for humanity to live? Did Adam and Eve still rebel? Did Christ still come and pay for our sins? Yeah. So there's nothing about finding life out there that's inherently antagonistic towards finding life in the universe. Now, the big question is, okay, so if there's sentient life out there, what's the deal with their redemption? So what are options? How could that work out that are consistent? Now, remember, it's important that we think well about this because God has this cool attribute that he is one God in three persons. Creator of the universe, fashioned earth, put humanity on it, humanity rebelled, sent his son, the second person of the Godhead, came down to earth, took on a human nature, died on the cross, rose from the dead, atoned for our sins. Now we can have a right relationship with God. So if there are these other beings out there that are sentient, what do we do with their redemption? A question for y'all. I mean, I'm going to give you my answers here in a second. Does that work at all? So somebody over here, I think it was you that said we're created in God's image, right? So God created humans in his image. Are we perfect image? Or sorry, let's ask this question carefully. Do we reflect all of God's image? We are created in his image, but we are not God's exact image, correct? Might it be possible that there are other image bearers whose image is different than ours? Possibly. So in the same way, Christ came, took on a human nature. He might have taken on a Klingon nature as well. Maybe. Okay, so that's one option. What other options do we have? Is it possible that these sentient beings didn't rebel against God? Would they need a redeemer? No. Anybody know who C.S. Lewis is? Anybody know about the Space Trilogy? No? Great set of works. Read it. He deals with that sort of scenario in his Space Trilogy. So we've got two options. One, they didn't fall. Two, they fell, but they have a different nature, and so Christ took on a different nature. I've given you a couple options. What other options could we have? Yes?
We could just have those other sentient life forms know that Jesus took on a human nature, because I feel like if he was going to change for other aliens, I feel like he would have taken on like a lion form or like a dog form or like a snail form to sacrifice for different animals that have sinned too.
Well, I think humans are unique in their capacity to sin. I don't think a lion can sin. But I do think you're right. It may be, and I'm going to extrapolate. Maybe this isn't what you're saying, but you're close enough. I'm going to say it anyway. It may be that God's message is, hey, there's this other planet where Christ took on a human nature and paid for everybody's sin. That's a possibility. That could be the message of redemption for this people. So we got 3 options so far. What else? It's possible they're not redeemable. Do we have any examples of that in Scripture? What? And? Satan and? The rest of the angelic realm that followed him. For whatever reason, they had a one-time decision that when they rebelled, there was no chance of redemption. So we tend to not like that idea, but yet that's one of the ideas. So we got at least 4 different options here. It could be, the 5th option, that God has some other means of redemption. So do you see how understanding good theology helps answer this question that seems like, well, if there's sentient beings out there, that's a problem to Christianity. Well, God hasn't told us, so we don't know exactly. But even if there's sentient beings out there, there are good theological options for how to deal with that. And I say this, Christians have thought about this for centuries. This was, I can document discussions of this at least 500 or 600 years ago. And it's entirely possible that we're the only life in the universe. So, what I find fascinating about this, and I'm going to open it up for your questions, is that this is a fascinating discussion, a fascinating question of life out there. It's great. It's a great scientific discussion because finding planets is hard and getting the information to assess whether there's life on a planet is tricky, and there's all sorts of things that go into that. But it's a great theological question too. We see evidence that God has orchestrated and designed and fabricated and worked so that this planet hosts humans who he created us to be here. And we see evidence of God's handiwork here. Were it not for God's handiwork, we wouldn't be here. So if God did it here, the outstanding theological question is, did he do it somewhere else? Don't know. He didn't tell us, but he didn't rule it out either. So if we find life, I'll give you my answer. I don't know. I don't expect to find life, given what I know scientifically. But if we do find life, wouldn't surprise me. So, what questions do you have? Yes. I think we have a microphone for you.
I was just wondering what your opinions were on Skinwalker Ranch, if you've heard of that.
I have heard of Skinwalker Ranch about an hour and a half ago, and I have no idea what it is. Can you explain a little bit for me what it is?
So my mom, my dad, and I were kind of obsessed with that show.
Okay.
It's actual scientists, like from NASA, are finding a lot of strange, just strange things happening around Skinwalker Ranch, like craters in the earth.
Okay.
And like the battery on their camera is being drained even when they enter a certain area. Okay. And cows are getting attacked.
It sounds weird. It really sounds weird. What I will say this is the idea that those are aliens that have traveled to Earth is incredibly unlikely, if not impossible. Now, I will put this up here. This is the last slide. You have the great privilege of reading one of my books, because I wrote a book called Is There Life Out There, where I just go through and I try and think through scientifically all of these questions of, could life be out there? What elements are necessary? How does this all play out? And one of the questions I have is, could life travel from there to here? Now, one thing that often gets missed in the discussion of space is that it is really, really, really big. We launched a satellite 1969, I believe it was. It was in the early 60s, late 60s, early 70s. It's been traveling for about 50 years now. Voyager 1, Voyager 2, Pioneer 10 and 11. These satellites are traveling about 65,000 miles an hour. They're hauling. It has taken them 50 years to get just outside the shock wave of the sun traveling through our galaxy. It will take them 40,000 years to get closer to another star than to the sun. And another 40,000 years to actually get to another star compared to the sun. 40,000 years. Now, you might say, all right, well, perhaps we can build technology that allows us to move maybe like 10% the speed of light. Well, then to get to the closest star, it will take us about 40 years. That's the minimum amount of time. Now, as you're traversing that distance, you're moving at roughly 10% the speed of light. There's an exercise you can do that if you were to take a baseball, throw it at the speed of light towards the catcher, what do you think happens? What's the final outcome of that? What? The catcher dies? Think bigger.
The planet dies.
Little too big, but yes, okay. What you can do is you think, okay, something moving at nearly the speed of light, okay, we don't have a good sense of that. But the amount of energy that's dissipated in that ball as it lands just behind home plate is the equivalent of detonating a nuclear bomb. Now, you're traveling at 10% the speed of light and you happen to run into a little pebble out in space. What's going to happen to your ship? It's going to cause a lot of damage. So it's pretty dangerous traveling through space if you go really fast. And even if you just kind of go at it from an energy perspective, I think I figured out that if you, it's in my book, I remember doing the calculation and putting it in there. If you ask the question, how much energy does it take to get a ship that's 500 kilograms, which is not too many. I'm 100 kilograms. So 500 kilograms up to 10% the speed of light is about the equivalent of the energy output of the United States in 1 year. So I'm just saying there's lots of stuff that argues against space travel. And so I don't know what's going on at this ranch, but the idea that it's aliens that have come here and have done stuff, I'm pretty sure that's not it. What I suspect it is that a lot of what we talk about as alien activity, once you get rid of all the stuff that we can explain, like, okay, there's rockets and there's military stuff, once you get what's left that isn't explainable by natural phenomena, mirrors demonic activity. And that's what I suspect is probably going on there. That was a long answer. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you think the moon would make a good port for space travel?
Do I think the moon would make a good port for space travel? Well, it's certainly much easier to launch something from the moon than it is from the Earth, because the gravitational pull on the moon is about 1/6 that of the Earth. Now, the challenge of having the moon be a spaceport is that it is incredibly dry. There's very little water there. There's an old saying, I went out and had dinner on the moon. Food was great, but there was no atmosphere. Because there's no atmosphere. Far side. Is that where that came from?
I think there was a comment there.
Okay, I pirate my jokes off of many places, so that could have very well been it. It's a very inhospitable place for humans to live, for humans to be. So, yes, it's easier to get off the planet. Yes, we could build domes that would protect us and allow us to have concentration atmosphere that would allow us to live there. But one other thing we need to bear in mind is this, that my research is my physics training or astrophysics training was originally in gamma ray astronomy. And so you've got your light, and there's the electromagnetic spectrum, and you got visible light here, and infrared, and microwave, and radio waves over there, and then you go up here, and you got ultraviolet, and you got X-rays, and then you got gamma rays. And if you take this light and say that's one, visible light, X-rays, like you go to the doctor, those have an energy of about 10,000. If you go up to the Incredible Hulk, that was about 1 million. The gamma rays I studied had energies of 1 trillion. Now, the way we detect those gamma rays is as they come and hit the top of the atmosphere, they generate this big shower of particles that are moving faster than the speed of light in air, and they give off the equivalent of, when you move faster than the speed of sound, you get a sonic boom. Move faster than the speed of light, you get an optical boom, which is called Cherenkov radiation. And if you built a detector on the ground, you could detect this flash of light. The atmosphere is filtering out these gamma rays so that they don't get down to the Earth. If you get rid of the atmosphere, take a square meter detector, there's 1,000 gamma rays and cosmic rays every second hitting it. That's what the atmosphere is filtering out from hitting you and I. So you go to the moon, you got to deal with all that radiation as well. Yeah?
Is that also what they have to deal with on the International Space Station?
Yes, they do. Now, the nice part, the one thing you've got kind of working for you is that the cosmic rays that cause a lot of damage are less abundant, but in the trip, when you go to Mars and back, you spend about 2 years getting to Mars and back. You get exposed to about 1/5 of a lethal dose of radiation. We've measured that in our satellites that we put out there. Now, the nice part is that's spread out over 2 years. Your body recovers and heals itself. But there's all sorts of problems with living up in space, that people on the space station have muscular problems. Their muscles tend to decay. They have skeletal problems because their bones don't grow right. They have intestinal problems because the radiation damages their intestines. They have, what's the word for brain? Cognitive problems, because our bodies are not designed to live in that level of radiation. And so it's not impossible, but there are some pretty good challenges. But if you want to get out into space, you probably ought to start somewhere other than the Earth, because it's really expensive to get stuff from the Earth out into space, because Earth has a lot of gravity. Yes?
Do you think nuclear energy could be a possibility for space travel?
You're going to have to do something like that to even get close, yes. I am going to be really picky about one thing. It's nuclear. That's the physicist in me. No, I'm joking. You're going to have to do something like that, because the amount of energy you need to be able to move through space is enormous. And so to accelerate things up to that great velocity, nuclear energy, you take hydrogen, fuse it into helium, and you get a bunch of energy out of that. And if you can harness that into moving, then you've got some pretty good options there. The nice thing about space is that there's hydrogen scattered throughout space. So if you can gather it up, you might be able to just gather your fuel on the way of going somewhere. If you can gather it up, channel it in, you have your fusion go, and then put it out the back, then you might be able to do that. But something like that's going to happen. But even doing all that, you're still limited by moving at the speed of light through space. That's the speed limit getting through space. Yes, I'm going to go back here for a question. I think she's got a microphone just because she wants that. So.
I'm loud. When you had the three things up showing how the difference between how the universe was way back when and its progression, there you go.
That's actually just our solar system. But
okay, so our solar system.
Right.
How does that come about? Because we were not here, nor did we have machines that were. So where does this come from?
So you asked the question, given where our planets form, so there's a whole sequence that goes into that. You say, all right, we know roughly what size gas cloud you have to get a planet like, or a solar system like ours, because you got to be able to match the elements that are in the sun, because that's the dominant component of our solar system. And you say, all right, if it forms, how does that all form? Because the size of the cloud is going to determine the amount of mass in the disk. The amount of mass in the disk is what determines what planets form. And we know that once you get farther and farther out, these things clump together and don't make big planets. They tend to make this cloud of stuff. In fact, we see that in the asteroid belt because the gravitational pull of the sun and the gravitational pull of Jupiter was enough to keep it from all coalescing together. So the asteroid belt tells us that there was something like that further out. And when we look at distant stars, we can see these clouds of debris around them. So now that we know that it kind of looks like that and we can get the amount of mass, we say, all right, we know we start over there. That's what it had to look like at the start. How do we get from there to there? And what we've found, as we found other planets, around other stars, what we realize is that there's a very common phenomena where planets will form in a certain location and then migrate to other locations. So a Jupiter-class planet has to form far enough away that ices exist. If it gets too close and all you have is gas, a Jupiter won't form because there's not the material to do it. So we know it forms and it's got to migrate. Well, we ask, how does our solar system migrate to reproduce this? There's only a few scenarios where you can make it work and get this. And so it's not that we were there and we took a picture of it, but we know how it started because we can get that from the data we have in our solar system and what it took to make that, and we know it ended up here. And then we just run simulations and say, all right, how do we get from there to here, and how confident are we? And we're getting more and more confident that something like this happened, that we actually probably lost a planet and all of this stuff around dispersed so that it's not in the inner part of our solar system, and it's probably out in the outer reaches of our solar system, which is cool because it's better out there than in here.
Regarding the James Webb Telescope results that have just come out, somewhat challenging possible theory of the Big Bang.
Yes.
What do you feel about how that some of those results that they're getting are quite inconsistent with what astrophysicists were thinking they would find?
So there were the James Webb Space Telescope, just a little bit of background, it is kind of the successor to the Hubble Space Telescope, which is a little bit of a misnomer because the Hubble Space Telescope was designed to see visible and ultraviolet and a little bit of infrared. Well, the further away you look, the more stuff is redshifted, and so all this light that the Hubble was designed to see gets shifted over into the infrared. So they built this this James Webb telescope that can see things out in the infrared more. Now there are claims, when the Webb was now taking observations, it's looking at these distant galaxies that were formed within the first billion years of the universe, and they were much larger. They were larger and more well defined than what we expected. And there was a person who said, this matches what my expectations were, my model, and my model says there was no Big Bang, and there was a whole lot of stuff that went along with that. And so he's got this a couple of observations that are detailed observations, and he's saying, okay, that means this model is correct. So that's what's gotten all of the publicity on that. Now, what's important to note is that this guy's model, this guy's way of looking at the universe has been around for 3 decades. He originally proposed this back in the 90s, I think it was. And people have looked and said, does it account for what we see in our universe? And there are some major problems with it. And so there's an article, or I wrote an article that kind of outlines some of how the science plays out in that on our website. I think it's called, does the James Webb Space Telescope disprove the Big Bang? It's something like that. But if you search for that article, you'll get this sort of thing where we build a new instrument, we find something we didn't expect, and we have to go and iron out and figure out the details. That sort of thing has gone on repeatedly over the last 40 years that I've been involved in science. For example, go back into the 1990s, and we were finding stars that were older than the universe. Now that's a little bit problematic. Turns out that our way of estimating the age of stars needed some refinement, and they were not as old as we thought they were. Our way of measuring how old the universe was needed some more data and refinement. It was older than we thought it was, and when we went and did the work, we found out that, lo and behold, they lined up well, by and large. There's still one star that still seems to be older than the universe, but we've done enough work to think, okay, there's something going on there that we don't understand, and that rather than the Big Bang being wrong, it's likely that we don't understand this situation well enough yet. That's what's going on. That's my suspicion of what's going on with this particular observation from the James Webb Space Telescope. We've had, I just list numerous examples where we have scenarios like that, where it says, all right, there's more that we need to understand. And as we dig in and understand, we almost always find that, that helps us refine our models, get more details, get a more accurate model of the universe, and all of those affirm Big Bang cosmology. Part of why I think that's right is because what we find in terms of galaxies isn't the dominant piece of evidence in terms of whether the Big Bang happened or not. That has to do with the cosmic microwave background radiation, large-scale clusters of things. Numerous other things are the evidence that point into that, and James Webb has no capacity to weigh in on all that evidence. So it's a very interesting problem that we don't have an answer for yet, but come back in about 10 years and I'll probably have a better answer for you. Unfortunately, well, I'm not going to say unfortunately. The reality of it is that's the way science works most of the time. Love to think it's okay, we make these measurements, and this just answers all the questions. And more times than not, it's like, what's going on here? How do we do that? And those problems can persist for decades before we finally have the technology or the data that weighs in and gives us the final answer. Science is just littered with problems like that. And that's what scientists love, because those are cool problems to work on. I am working on an instrument where we're trying to figure out what in the world dark matter is. We've been asking that question for 80 years. I'm hopeful that we'll find out. If we do, the project that I'm working on, the fellow who leads it will probably get a Nobel Prize for it. We get to go fly a balloon in Antarctica, north or south of it. No, you said south was that way, didn't you? So we get to go fly a balloon down in Antarctica. That's north. Well, okay, just go far enough that way. I'll get around there eventually, but and hopefully we'll figure out what dark matter is. But that's just the nature and the course of the way science works. Go back over here.
Okay, so you got a quote from the guy who said we have to keep in mind that the opposite. So if you were asked, I mean, obviously there's a lot of assumptions in science, but you as a scientist, if you were asked, so what is your succinct answer to why you believe there's a creator? And it is created and not. I don't remember how he said it, but that we have to keep in mind.
We have to keep in mind that what we see was not designed, but rather evolved. I say, why? If it looks like it's designed, perhaps the best conclusion is that it's designed. And so let's rather than take one example, let's look, is this a pattern that we see that we have to keep explaining away the design? Or is it, as we understand things more, the design just kind of naturally disappears? And what we find is that the more we understand about something, the more the design seems to show up. And so that would be my answer. It's like, why do I have to say this wasn't designed? If it looks designed, a very natural conclusion to draw is it designed? And then let's see whether that way of looking at things helps us explain future results better or not. We're finding more and more design. I showed you Francis Crick making that statement, but there's Fred Hoyle, who was the scientist who figured out how stars produce carbon. Again, a very prominent agnostic. He makes the statement, it looks like a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology. So this is not just a one-time occurrence. We see that evidence of design and fine-tuning and intellect and all across science. So that would be my response. So we've answered every question. Okay. Two of them up here.
If I understood you correctly, did you say gamma rays travel faster than the speed of light?
No, gamma rays travel at the speed of light because they are light.
Okay.
When they enter the atmosphere, they create a shower of particles, and the particles are moving faster than the speed of light in air.
Okay.
So as light, or as so every medium has an index of refraction. So the index of refraction of air is something like 1.0001 or something like that. Which means that the speed of light in air is the speed of light in vacuum divided by that index of refraction. So the speed of light is lower, but you can have particles that can move faster than that because the maximum speed is the speed of light in vacuum. So it's kind of like a sonic boom. You've said, all right, okay, that's not clear.
Well, I guess my question is, at this time, the speed of light in vacuum is the fastest that we think anything can ever travel?
It's more than the fastest we think it is. That's a fundamental tenet of how we understand the universe. That the speed of light in vacuum is a maximum velocity that anything can move through space. When light enters other media, the speed of light will slow down, and things can move faster than that local speed, not the speed in vacuum. And so that's what's happening with the gamma rays.
Speaking of dark matter, I've heard theories that some people think that like there's just a whole bunch of black holes dotted throughout galaxies that kind of hold them together, because like isn't that?
There is an idea that black holes make up the dark matter. The reality, so where the current understanding is that we can look at galaxies and clusters of galaxies and even within our solar system and make measurements and say, okay, there's some level of dark matter. We can measure the amount of dark matter that's there. It's got a gravitational signature that is relatively easy to measure. The big question is, what is the dark matter? We think it's some sort of particle. It could be black holes, it could be WIMPs, it could be axions. We've got all sorts of cool names for these different kinds of things that it might be. One of the leading candidates are these WIMPs, which stand for weakly interacting massive particles. And so if they're WIMPs, they're going to have certain sorts of behavior, and we're trying to look for that kind of behavior. So one of the ideas, though, is that black holes might have been some of the dark matter. It's black holes, or dark matter in the form of black holes doesn't account for the whole picture. So there may be black holes that provide some amount of dark matter, but it's not the whole explanation. Okay. Question over here.
Would you say the thought of aliens is more like programmed in us as far as media and things go? Because every time you see a UFO or something like that, or there's a story about aliens, it seems like it's kind of programmed in us that we kind of go to that tendency that there's aliens out there, you know.
I would agree with that it's certainly true that what we see going on in society affects how we think about aliens. And where I first recognized the influence of that, you ever seen a movie called Signs? All right, some people really like that movie. That's good. I remember watching that. I was in graduate school when I watched it. And I remember, so there's this semi-realistic, it's meant to be real, not sci-fi, if you will. And I remember, spoiler alert, the alien was real. And I was like, wow, that's unusual, because the alien was always the mayor dressed up in a suit because he wanted power, if you watched enough of Scooby-Doo when you were growing up. That the whole idea was there were no aliens, it was always some explanation. That was the first one where it's like, oh, the alien was real. Watched that with my kids later, and they were not at all surprised because the alien was always real. So, yes, what goes on in society influences what our default tendency is towards that. And you look at the movies we have out there, and aliens are all over the place.
One other thing is early civilization, what we couldn't explain was from the gods or something like that, but now kind of aliens have replaced God as far as the unexplained in a lot of ways, it seems like.
I think that's true of a lot of people. I was noticing or making a comment when we were here, or to one of the folks I was talking with earlier tonight, and just this recognition that we're far more scientifically literate as a society than at any time in history, but yet we also seem to have far more superstitious thought at the same time. There's that interesting dynamic going on there, that there's this tendency to think the more scientifically literate, the more that superstition is going to go away. I'm inclined to think that the less biblically, the less Judeo-Christian worldview influences the way you think, you're going to be more superstitious in what goes on. I mean, just look throughout the history of Israel, they were always thinking it was some other God doing something. So, I mean, that's just, I think that's kind of where we're wired in our DNA to think there's some being out there doing it. And if we're not going to call it God, we're going to call it something else. So, but that's more psychology than astronomy.
One more question. At this time, as we keep looking further into the universe, we haven't found the end, correct? We just find more galaxies and more galaxies. Is that true?
We have yet to, that's a complicated question, because when you look through telescopes like the James Webb, yeah, there's always more galaxies, more stuff out there. Now, there's a limit to how far we can look, because the universe, there's a maximum speed things can move through the universe, and there's an age of the universe. 14 billion years for the age, 3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second for the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, if you want to go with it in those terms. So as you look further away, light takes longer and longer to get to the Earth. And so the maximum distance we can look away until we develop gravitational telescopes is the cosmic microwave background radiation. So we've seen the edge of what's possible to see because we see the cosmic microwave background radiation, but we've never found a limit to the amount of galaxies. We haven't connected those two things yet. I think we had a question up here.
So you mentioned dark matter. What do you mean by that exactly?
So as astronomers look at things, there's this cool phenomena that first came out with Newton, but Einstein says the same thing, is that if you want to determine the mass of something, you don't, it's like, so I want to determine the mass of the Earth. How am I going to do that? Don't have a scale, can't put it in a bathtub, there's no way to do that. I can look at the moon. The moon's orbit tells me the mass of the Earth. So I can go out and look at the moon's orbit, and that says, okay, I know how much mass the Earth is. If I want to figure out the mass of the sun, look at the orbits of the planets. Nice thing is you can measure it from Mercury, Mars, Earth, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. You can do it with all of them. You can do it with the asteroids, and they all give the same answer, which is really good. It means we're doing things right. So astronomers can now take that principle, look out at a galaxy, and say, all right, let's measure the orbits of the stars. And believe it or not, you can tell where the orbit is and where it's moving. We can make those measurements. So you can say, all right, I know what the orbit of this star is. That tells me how much mass is inside that. So I know how much mass is because of the orbits. And then I go out and say, all right, I can count up the stars. And I know the masses of the stars, and that tells me how much mass is in the stars. That's light matter, if you will. And lo and behold, in almost every galaxy we look at, the amount of mass that must be there to explain the orbits is more than the amount of mass in the stars. And so astronomers, being really creative, called that dark matter. That's what dark matter is. It's matter that doesn't give off light, yes. If you want to be really technical, it's matter that doesn't interact electromagnetically.
So, in high school, or just life in general, it's not uncommon to hear a lot about zodiac signs and star signs on a day-to-day basis. But as a believer, in Christ, I don't believe in star signs. But as a believer and an astrophysicist, how would you deal with being questioned about star signs? Because there's not any factual evidence behind it.
Well, so the first thing I would do is, one, I would want to know, why does the person think that works? It may be that they're just playing around having fun. It may be they've been taught that. Who knows what it is. So I would want to understand what's going on there. But there's a fundamental flaw in those sorts of arguments is that I was born on January 6, 1969. I know other people who were born on January 6, 1969. If there's any credibility to this, we were both born on the same planet, in the same, in the same area, at the same time, and yet we have very different likes, dislikes, personalities, whatever. If where I'm born and what stars are in the sky governs what's going on, we ought to have pretty much identical lives. And when you look at people, it's not really hard to find two people that have the same birthday in the same region, and you'll find that they just don't have the very similar lives. So if the fundamental premise is where the stars were and what was going on is driving what's going on, we would see evidence of that we don't actually see when we do the data, when we take the measurements. And that's probably the simplest explanation of why that's not the right way to look at things. Now, what you're going to get beyond that is who knows? I know and have interacted with people that are convinced the earth is flat. And there is no amount of evidence I can give them. I will give you an example. I was talking with one fellow and I said, you know what? You can go out and say there are pages that tell you where satellites are. So there's a space station orbiting the Earth, and I can tell you, and you can look it up for yourself, where the space station will be. Go take your telescope, put a camera on it. You don't need a very large telescope. Put a camera on it and take a picture of it when it goes over. And his response was, oh yeah, NASA puts up weather balloons. There's just no amount of data I could give to this fellow that would change. There's something else going on. And so that's why, yes, it's good to I would look for an explanation to say, well, if that's true, how do you explain this? But then recognize there's probably something more. And the last piece of counsel I would give there is that what I've realized about myself is this. If I am convinced of a position and you come and tell me, here's why you're wrong, here's the data that tells you why you're wrong, most of the time what you're going to get from me, unless I step back to think, is I'm going to defend my position. If you get me to think about why I hold my position, if I'm going to change it, you've done 90% of the work. How do you get people to think about why they believe? Is that really a good way to look at it? So think about it from that way, because then you're thinking about the person, engaging with where they are, instead of trying to force them to listen to what you're saying. Get really good at asking questions. It's amazing what you can get people to think about just by asking them questions that you actually want to know what they have to say about. So
great question, Samantha.
That was.
I think we have time for one more after Jeremy.
I was reading earlier, and it said that they believe the universe is flat.
Yes, I do too.
It's weird that the Earth is round, and then the universe is flat because it's spreading out in all these directions. So it's just kind of weird that that's how they define things. You know. What would be your answer to that?
I would say, yes, the earth is round, and yes, the universe is flat. Okay. Now, I hearken this back to, if you remember from your geometry class, I always had this one phrase that just bothered me. It talked about parallel lines. And they said, okay, parallel lines stay the same distance apart, and there was always this caveat that I didn't even remember hearing until I got into college, but there was always this caveat in a Euclidean geometry. I'm like, okay, great, what does that mean? Didn't know at the time. Once I finally got to college, I realized this. Flat, as the geometry people are talking about, is not the same as two-dimensional. So in a flat table, if I draw parallel lines, they stay parallel, correct? But I can give you an example where I have parallel lines that converge. Anybody know where? Nope, train tracks stay parallel. A globe. Go take an equator, take the equator on the globe. All the lines of longitude are intersected at a 90-degree angle, so they're all parallel. What happens to the lines of longitude? They intersect at the poles because that's a curved geometry. It's a closed geometry. So when they're talking about the universe, they're not talking about two-dimensional flat. They're talking about geometrically flat. And so in a flat universe, triangles, angles add up to 180. In a closed geometry, who knows what they add up to? There's an open geometry where in a closed geometry, parallel lines converge. In an open geometry, parallel lines diverge. That's what they're talking about there. So you just got to realize they use the same words, but they don't mean the same thing. Got one way in the back there.
Is it about Skinwalker Ranch Mako? Because your daughter already out.
Oh, I'm going to get. Hi. Okay, so I have a question.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on the 2004 Tic Tac video that was caught off the USS Nimitz? I think it was a
2004
nuclear
Tic Tac video. What is the Tic Tac video? Explain basically what it was.
Looks like a Tic Tac, but they have it recorded on multiple platforms. So
Right.
radar from the jet fighters that were scrambled. The ship has, they had visual.
Mm-hmm.
They had a bunch of different recordings of it, but they couldn't account for the physics of it and how it moved.
So I don't know specifically.
Okay.
You asked if I had thoughts, so yes, I have thoughts, and I'll tell you my thoughts. It's interesting that happened on a military vessel. If you were fighting against a foe where you had superior military air power, what would be something you would do to combat that? Well, you would try and get up and build better equipment, but I just recently rewatched Top Gun Maverick. And he's fighting against a jet that has superior technology. And he fires his missile at it, and it blows it up. He has this weird maneuver that gets him out of the way, and then he comes down. And what is his thought? I need to get down low because the ground will confuse his sensors. My suspicion is there's some military technology that confuses your sensors. And if you're going to develop that, you want to develop it to make it look like, oh, there's something there and I've got to worry about it. That's my suspicion. I don't know because I haven't studied those in detail and they don't give me the military secrets that would allow me to answer it anyway. So that's my suspicion. I will go back to the answer I gave over here. I'm almost convinced it's not aliens. In fact, I'm convinced it's not aliens. I suspect it's either military or possibly demonic, although I think that's less likely to be demonic in that instance. So. Yeah, we can't make a craft that does that, but it doesn't surprise me that we can fool sensors into believing it's a craft that did that. That's what I think is going on. And we spend a lot of time fooling other people's military. That's what the flares are. You got these heat-seeking missiles, let's throw out flares. It'll think it's a plane, it'll blow those up instead of the actual people. That's a better thing. So, your call on whether we're done or not. So.
All right. Does anyone have a quick last-minute question?
So I will just say this. I'm going to put this back up. There we go. If you're interested, I have a book, Is There Life Out There, that explores, can you get through the universe? Does life require carbon? What about water? How do we find planets? Would finding life impact Christianity? All these sorts of questions. It's I think a pretty accessible book. If you scan that, give us a little information. The book's available out there at our table. You can actually scan the code out there too if you want. But I appreciate the time to be here. Great questions. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for being here with us today. Thank you, thank you. And I would like to encourage you guys, if you were at all moved by this and want to support what they're doing over at Reasons to Believe for other talks like this, we have a black box that you can donate to them and their ministry over there. They're doing amazing things. If you have not been here for the last few weeks, you should go online and catch up and watch them. And I'm going to steal someone's book to give you guys a little plug for next week. Sorry, Sophia. Next week, we have Ken Samples joining us, and the topic is Jesus, the only hope of the world's religion. So I want to encourage you to join us next week for even more amazing topics. I am so thankful for all of the scholars over at Reasons to Believe and their willingness to come and be a part of it. And thank you so much for being here. All right, have a great week, everyone.